Good evening. I'm going to go ahead and call this Wednesday, February 8th, special personnel meeting of the whole Somerville School Committee to order. Superintendent Hurley, will you call the roll?
Dr. Ackman.
Present.
Mayor Ballantyne. Ms. Petone.
Present.
Dr. Phillips.
Present.
Ms. Dion.
Present.
Ms. Barish.
Present.
President Ewenkampen. Ms. Krepshin.
Present.
Mr. Green.
Present.
We have a quorum.
The mayor sends her regrets. She's dealing with a family emergency and is currently at the hospital. And President Ewenkampen is currently presiding over a city council meeting. With that, we'll go ahead and introduce our interpreters, starting with Haitian Creole.
Allô, bonsoir, et c'est Cynthia et c'est moi-même qui interprète pour nous à soir et pour capable joindre tout ça qu'a dit en créole ou à regarder le blanc côté que ou après French qui c'est français mais c'est en créole pour la pied ou à cliquer li et puis ou à capable joindre toute traduction en créole. Encore bienvenue. Merci.
Thank you. Next, we'll have our Portuguese interpreter.
Oi, meu nome é Gel Mollen, eu sou intérprete para o português simultâneo de hoje. Procure o globo na tela abaixo e clique português. Good afternoon, this is Gel Mollen. I will be the interpreter for this session tonight. And if you want to hear in Portuguese, look for the globe below and click Portuguese. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, our Spanish interpreter.
Hello, good night. My name is Sandra. I'm the Spanish interpreter. If you want interpretation click the globe below. Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Sandra. Yo soy la intérprete de español. Si necesita escuchar esta reunión en español, por favor, haga clic en el globo de abajo y seleccione el canal de español. Gracias.
Thank you. So we have one on tonight's agenda, which is the interview for Dr. Marisa Mendonsa, for the position of Superintendent of Somerville Public Schools. So I'll walk through quickly how this will go. The first round will be a series of pre-selected questions. Each member of this body will ask one, with exceptions that Dr. Ackman, myself, and Ms. Krepshin will each ask two. Question before we go around and give an opportunity to ask the second question. And we'll continue with that until all questions are exhausted. Before we begin with that, we have told you we'll give you 3 minutes to introduce yourself. So, Dr. Mendonsa, the floor is yours.
So I first just wanted to thank the search committee for identifying me as a finalist, and all of you taking the time.
Actually, just in the spirit of fairness, we're going to pause until we figure out that feedback thing so it doesn't distract you. Yeah, I will recess until it's resolved. Do you want to try?
Good evening.
Nope.
Keep talking. Keep talking.
You were 6.
Testing. All right.
All right. whatever is going on, it seems to be working.
Trying to think of the most like family-friendly story I can tell.
That was a story about small children, like, and this was going to go somewhere wild and unexpected. It seemed pretty family friendly to me.
It is not wildly unexpected. They turned on each and every microphone. All right.
All right.
Stop
Suzanne said
yammering.
we're live, so we're going to stop rambling, but I am going to wait for my superintendent and my liaison to come back.
My daughter did insist. No, okay, I'm gonna keep talking. My daughter insisted. Oh, now I'm back on that one. My daughter insisted that we take a video of her on the mic that I was supposed to send to her teacher. So her teacher, Miss Schroeder, got a recorded audio.
It's like, what do you do in these downtimes? All right.
We're super tech savvy here.
Susanna said the audio was good.
All right. Suzanne said the audio was good.
Yeah, Susanna just texted me and said the audio was good.
Okay, we can continue. I'm just gonna leave because you could hear my computer and that's okay.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna.
Okay. I call us back into order, and I will do this introduction, take 3. Dr. Mendonsa.
Thank you. So I first want to thank the search committee for identifying me as a finalist and for all of you taking the time tonight to meet with me and to learn more about my candidacy. It has been a pleasure to visit with Somerville community today and to get to know your incredible district a little bit better. I've spent the past several weeks researching and wondering about all your district has to offer and all it seeks to achieve. What drew me to Somerville first and foremost is your public commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I firmly believe that if we root our schools in this work, our communities will be stronger and our students and caregivers will have a stronger sense of belonging. Additionally, I felt that my own educational background, philosophy, and approach connects to the work being done in Somerville. Whether it be from an innovation school lens, which I was a part of as a teacher in Springfield, the implementation of restorative practices, or the ability to provide a comprehensive educational experience for students, including dual language, therapeutic, and CTE programming. My wife, Jackie, and I have 2 teenage daughters, a senior in high school currently preparing for the next big chapter in her life, and a 19-year-old on the edge of discovering all the possibilities the world has to offer, and then discovering who she aspires to be. My wife is an elementary principal, and our daughters have often joked that they can't believe they have two parents who are educators, so they could never get away with anything in school. I agreed, and I also understand the privileges my position has granted me, specifically the ability to navigate the special education world when my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD as well as a specific learning disability in math. I use this experience to work with special education parents and to help them navigate what can be a challenging and often confusing world. While the experiences outlined on my resume showcase who I am as an educator, I am excited to be with you here tonight to share more details and to paint a picture of you for the kind of leadership I would bring to the Somerville Public Schools. Thank you again for welcoming me into your community and showing me the Highlander habits in action across your district. Thank you.
If you would describe the core values that drive you in your work, what would they be and how they guide you in your work?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, equity is a core value of mine, and it would drive the work in every aspect of everything that we do, from developing policy to developing curriculum to thinking about the ways that we work with our students when they need to have consequences, and also in the ways that we recruit and retain our educators. I think a second core value for me in terms of education, and I think this has shifted a little bit since the pandemic, is joy. Seeing joy in classrooms, seeing joy from educators and our students. I think we lost a sense of joy during the pandemic because schooling was so very different. And in addition to a significant shift to focus on our mental health, and I think joy has been lost a bit. And so it's a guiding light for me now to ensure that joy is experienced not only by our students, but also our staff. Respect is really important to me, respecting one another in the process. While we can disagree, we want to be able to respect each other in those disagreements and come together stronger because of those disagreements rather than being divided. Innovation is highly important to me in education. I think we've come at a crossroads where we are trying to, in some ways, stop technology innovation from happening and slow it down so that it doesn't get away from us. We have mini computers in our pockets, and now we're wondering how to store those and lock them away. And I wonder if we need to just lean in to that world and think about ways that we can do education differently. And I think transparency is another core value for me. I really want to make sure that I'm transparent in my decisions. I'm transparent in what is working and what is not working, and I never want to pretend to be blind to the problems that may exist in a community or in a school or in a district. And that transparency can lead to really collective distributive leadership and collaboration among all of us to come together and ultimately come out stronger on the other side.
Thank you. Dr. Ackman.
What has been your experience overseeing the department that oversees special education, and what do you see as the most important facets of the management role?
Yeah, so I think in general, as a principal, it was overseeing my special education teachers and working directly with the special education director. And in my role as the deputy superintendent, I work very closely with the director of special education, as well as the directors of alternative education and social emotional learning, which is all tied together in terms of services or programs that we provide. We meet monthly as a group to really talk about what's happening in our schools and really think about ways that we can support our principals. But more importantly, we also meet every week as a district student support team where we work with our schools and thinking about considerations for our students, troubleshoot with our teams of educators at the school-based level and thinking about our students in terms of special education. What are the current offerings we have as a school district? What is working for a particular student? What are additional supports and needs? As a building principal, I can remember feeling this is all I can offer in my school, I think. And I needed expertise and advice. And Pittsfield has created a really wonderful system of a weekly meeting where schools can come to us and problem solve and present students to us and say, how can we work better and stronger for our students? And in some cases, it may mean that they need a different program or a different school setting. But most likely, the outcome is developing a plan for our students, thinking about a formative behavioral assessment, thinking about different accommodations or modifications from the IEP lens. And I think more importantly, the lens of special education is really thinking about in consideration of how our caregivers are represented in the special education process and ensuring that they have a place at the table. And so I'm often invited to meetings with parents in terms of special education, even if it's a one-year re-eval versus a 3-year, just to offer a sense of support, to offer that lens as a parent, and to also then assure that our district is doing the most that it can for our students. I think additionally, what we've been able to do as a district in my current role is really think about current programming in the district and work with our principals around what don't we have and what should we have as a district. I think everyone can always get stronger in special education programming, and I think one of the areas that we have that we really need to look at is more of a hybrid model for students in some of our sub-separate programs. Right now, they truly are functioning as sub-separate programs, and there are many students who are on the cusp of being able to have a more least restrictive environment with inclusion setting, but they don't have that opportunity in all places to have a moment to leave their program, to experience it, but then to be able to go back to a home base if they really need that support again. It's kind of all or nothing right now, and so we're really working hard with our building principals, as well as our special education liaisons who manage the caseloads of special education students, and our staff to think about the future of special education for the Pittsfield Public Schools, and I'm part of that process of overseeing those conversations and then really thinking about the budgeting process through that lens, right? So thinking about if we're adding more programs, it may mean more staff. But on the other side of it, it could mean that we're not sending as many students out of district, and so there's a cost savings there that we can use differently. And in Somerville, it then becomes a question of space. You know, how do we provide the space? And a space that is welcoming, like the Full Circle high school setting. Like, that's an amazing space that you have here that feels like a mini school rather than an add-on or a separate wing that we just had to figure out how to place them somewhere in the system. I think that's really important for special education students to feel a deep connection. I can remember in middle school myself leaving my team to go into a sub-separate math classroom that was off team, and I couldn't figure out why I was going there. I didn't understand as a 12-year-old what that was about, and I wasn't told about it. I just knew I wasn't with my peers and something was different about me. And that created math phobia for me in that moment. So that lives with me, and it's part of my thinking about how we position our locations for special education programming.
Ms. Patone?
Thank you. Just a follow-up.
Sure.
You spoke about mostly in your current role in Pittsfield, it's sub-separate programming for many students with special needs. In your career, have you seen successful inclusion or participated in successful inclusion, and what do you think was necessary to make that successful?
So I think one of the main priorities of making a successful inclusion program is the professional development and training of classroom educators. I think often special education teachers are seen as the experts and that they must take the lead at all times for students to be successful in the mainstream classroom. And that should not be the case. We should all be responsible for our students on IEPs. The special education teacher really should be almost more in the role of a coach and a support system of helping educators understand how to develop lesson planning, to think about universal design for learning, and how to differentiate instruction in a diverse classroom. How to maintain high expectations and rigor for all students in the space, but also to be able to do it yourself as the classroom educator, using the special education teacher as a point person and support in terms of those maybe potential modifications or accommodations that need to occur. I think also working really directly with the students who identify as special education to ensure that they feel that they can achieve at all levels of communication. And I think furthermore, in terms of a model or a program that I felt was really successful, was a co-teaching model that we began at Mohawk Trail when I was the principal, that involved both special education teachers and also core content teachers. But we began it in the middle school level, and we began with both ELA and math classes, and that was our points, specifically because of MCAS testing, unfortunately. But what it led to us to do was to really develop a comprehensive program for a co-taught model, working over the summer for professional development with our educators. We didn't just throw teachers together and expect for them to figure it out and to work on it. It really was collaborative in nature, because we wanted visitors to be able to walk into that classroom and not know who the special education teacher was versus who the ELA teacher was. That was really important for us. And so we brought in an expert around co-teaching. We spent 3 full days with professional development, and then we continued with both outside and internal coaching of those pairs throughout the year by doing classroom visits and observations and providing feedback for them to self-assess and reflect, and then also surveying our students and families around how it felt to be in the co-taught spaces. Pittsfield has a similar model, but they've actually done it, an inclusion model with an entire elementary school, pre-K to 5, 2 classrooms per grade level, co-taught classrooms all the way through. This is our first year at the 5th grade level, and so we are looking to transition that into the middle schools for next year so that the students who are currently sitting in those inclusion settings will not lose those support services when they move into the middle school world. And so we're currently thinking about how to identify for 6th grade for next year who those teachers may be, and consider the training. We also began to shift it at one of our elementary schools, a different one, to add in the 2nd grade level a co-taught program that will start actually in February. And they have been working on it. I've been supporting the principals and the teachers through the co-teaching because of my background as a building principal before. And the great thing about it is the elementary school that's full inclusion co-taught is now a model school for us. And so the educators are able to visit and see it in action and then come back and problem solve before they're now about to implement and launch in their own spaces. I think co-teaching is a really important lens for us to consider, and I think that who better than to support the content instruction than our licensed special education teachers who are in our spaces with our students, who can adjust on the fly, who can look at data together with their core content teachers and really assess the whole package of our students, because they're there all the time with our students and not just coming in and doing some observations or just receiving data at team meetings because they're doing pull-out classes instead or academic skills classes. So trying to have a push-in model as much as possible, and that's not for all students, so I want to make that really clear. But I think where it can be done, it has been highly successful in my experience in both urban and rural areas. Sure.
Ms. Kripshin.
Can you describe for us an experience involving bargaining or labor relations that was particularly impactful in the way you approach working with unions, and explain why it was such an impactful experience?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The thing that comes to mind is, COVID policies and that. But, as a building principal at Mohawk Trail, it was very unique in that I sat with collective bargaining. So I've been in the collective bargaining business for many years now. It wasn't just when I became the deputy superintendent. It was a bit awkward at first to kind of take on that role because it was odd to be a principal in those sessions with educators and paraprofessionals. But what it did was actually just strengthen our relationship with the associations and with the union members. Because we were there at the table, we were listening to their concerns, we understood it. It didn't feel as though things were happening behind closed doors to us, but it was happening behind closed doors with us. And it really built that partnership. And so we worked on both the traditional contracts that you need to go through every 3 years, but then also during COVID and really adjusting and thinking about building schedules and the expectations for teachers around hybrid learning. And again, I really just think we came out of it much stronger in that process. And one of the things that Pittsfield does that I think is a really wonderful element to their collective bargaining experience is that regardless of whether you're in a contract year or not, we have a joint labor management committee that meets every month. and members of the union executive board meet with district leaders to bring ideas, recommendations, wonderings to us. And so prior to it getting to the point of, say, a grievance or a bone of contention, we've had those conversations. We've been talking about them. Most recently, we've been thinking about bringing content leads back into our buildings. We had eliminated department chairs many moons ago, and teachers are requesting for us to take a look at that. And so we've been working collaboratively to look at different models of content leads together. So we're doing the work collaboratively in these sessions so that when it comes time to develop an MOU or to build it into the next contract, we're all in it together already, and there's no kind of gotcha moments that are happening. And so if that's something that doesn't already exist in Somerville, and I was to become the superintendent, I would like to see something like that implemented to just really build the strength of that partnership. And I think one of the other important things to mention about collective bargaining is it's not always fun. Like, it's not the thing that people look forward to doing all of the time because it can be highly stressful. And I think the most important thing about it is finding ways to bring it back to our students in that process. So when we're making adjustments to a contract, how does it benefit our students when we do this? And in some ways, it may benefit our educators, which in turn benefits our students because of retention or because of the way that they felt that they've been worked with and addressed as humans and their needs that they need as both educators in a highly stressful position, and in how we value the work that they're doing. And so I think that's another important piece to that work.
Okay. Ms. Patone.
Can you give us an example of how you provided leadership during a challenging or difficult period? What were the issues and environment in which you worked, and what did you learn from the experience?
I think the COVID years were really difficult. Leading a school in a rural community where many of our students did not have internet access at home because it was impossible to get it. It didn't exist. I remember one parent saying, I can't even have satellite TV where I live. And students, we were the NPR story of students in parking lots accessing the Wi-Fi. And that was so incredibly stressful as a principal for students, especially in their senior year, trying to complete AP course and AP tests and doing it on their phones in their cars, when I just wanted to be able to let them into an empty building and use a space. And I think the other piece to it was just the general fear of coming back that following year for our educators. And I felt that fear too. And what I learned in that moment, which I don't know if I had learned it before that, was that I needed to shift my leadership to be more coming from a humanity point of view. That I knew it was going to be incredibly challenging for several years to come, and we didn't know when the end was going to be in sight. And that we had students who were going to be coming to us with gaps in their education, who had been working on worksheets and didn't have access to educators, and that there was stress and there was gaps. And in a rural community, they didn't have community. They didn't have pods that they were together because there wasn't anybody close enough for them to have pods with. And so really that socialization of coming back and learning how to interact with one another again was 10 times, I think, harder for us in a rural community. And then ensuring that educators felt safe when they came back, and navigating through the masks and the social distancing and really taking into consideration how they were feeling. We invited our teachers to come back. You know, we had those extended days from DESE at the start of the year. And I highly encouraged educators to come back into the building before they had to. We were in there, we were already working. Because for me, I shared, it was odd to come back into the building for the very first time. And I was walking the building thinking, should I be going into classrooms when kids are in here? Should I be breaking the seal of those barriers? What does it mean when I go to the restroom? How do I walk in the halls? Do we use lockers anymore? What should be touching? Should there be other entrances? What does it look like? Can I interact with humans? Do they want me to interact with them? And so slowly, day by day, more and more educators came in, and they got it, and they understood, and they were thankful for the push to come back earlier into the building than was necessary. And then I think for our families, it was really about, we're going to protect you. We're going to protect our students as much as possible. Yes, there will be outbreaks. We will navigate through that, and we will have challenges. But your student is not going to fall behind because they don't have the internet at home. We're going to find resources and ways to make up for that. And then just the challenges of seniors, you know, all those activities they wanted but couldn't have. And how could we do things that really felt special and unique to them as they navigated it, and twist to say, this is something to look back on, right? Who else is going to have this unique experience that you all have? And try to do some things that could garner fun, even if it was virtual in classroom settings, or if it was outside, and as many rain makeups as we possibly could for graduation. You know, we set like 5 dates in advance and just said one of these is going to be it, and we're going to be outside and we're going to do this together. And then the year before, we did individual outside ceremonies for students, that they at least had something that their families could watch and see them in robes, and cross a makeshift stage and earn that diploma. So it was really hard to work through all of that and to think about in a rural community how we could do this, and super challenging. But I think we came out, I think, stronger as a community because of that experience we held together. That was really important to us. Sure.
Okay, Dr. Phillips.
Please give us an example of how you have identified an inequitable situation and taken steps to focus on it and affect change.
This is a great question. I think one of the first things that comes to mind was when I was a middle school principal, and I had a parent bring up a concern around a student's grade in a class. They weren't doing well. And so I was looking at that with them and assessing it. And I happened to just pick another student to look at from another class, because there was considerations for changing teams. And so I was looking at the 2 7th grade math teachers and what they were each doing in their classrooms. And I realized when I was looking at it, they were very much in sync as educators in terms of what the curriculum was and what the assessments were that were being given. They used their common planning time really well and wanted 7th grade students to have similar experiences. But what I noticed when I was looking at it, it would say like quiz 1, test 2, project A. And the students had very similar grades. And then I noticed that the homework grade was very different for each student. One was doing their homework and one was not. And the outcome for those 2 students was the difference of a grade and a half. So one student was getting a B+ and the other student was getting a C. And I thought, wow, this has dropped this student significantly down. And then I realized that the way they weighted their grades was a doubling in difference in terms of homework. And so we had to pause and say, should homework really count this much for a student who's demonstrating proficiency on assessments, but is not completing homework, or maybe even classwork if they bundled it together? And so we as a school then began to look at our grading practices to ensure that we had consistency, so that a student with one teacher versus a student with another were not receiving different grades for performing the same way on our assessments. And so that was one of the first areas that I saw in inequity and addressed it as a school together, really considering, do we want to have a school-wide policy around what our homework or classwork or habits of work at the time really meant to students, and how much of it should count versus what they're able to demonstrate in terms of mastery.
Ms. Dion.
What important skills should students acquire by the time they finish K through 12? How would you determine them, and how would you measure success in a way that is fair to everyone?
That's a great question. So for me, in today's world, soft skills are really important in terms of collaboration and working together, self-advocacy, really understanding who you are as a learner. I would really love for every student in Somerville, if this does not already happen, and I'm not sure that it does, to lead their own conferences for their families, and to really talk about who they are as learners, to set goals for themselves and really see who they are in their educational journey, and for parents to actually be able to track that over time. And for our students, the lovely thing about most of your schools are that they're pre-K to 8s. And so we house these students for so many years, and you'd be able to track and see that growth over time. And then what you could even do at 5th grade is think about a passage portfolio, students demonstrating their readiness to enter the middle school years, and then potentially a passage portfolio at 8th grade to show their readiness for entering high school. And within those passage portfolios, those student-led conferences, are those touch points that you would identify as a school, as a district, of where you want students to demonstrate their mastery of learning in both social-emotional learning lens, but then also in that academic lens. I would also really love to see that students are fully engaged in project-based learning or community-based learning. How are we taking advantage of the community that we live in? What are kinds of projects that students could tie themselves to? I don't always love the term citizenship, because I think for our immigrant families, that can be a scary term around citizenship and can bring up some bad feelings. But how can we contribute to our community? How can we be contributors to the greater community? And the earlier that we do that for our students, whether it's students going to the library and considering the books that are on the shelves of the library as elementary students and making recommendations for what they would want to see to a librarian, or whether it's, when I was in Springfield, it was going and measuring trees for the city arborist to determine the health of trees in the area, or doing an audit in terms of the lighting system, and could we change out light bulbs to save energy? Our students can do those things and develop reports and presentations. So those are all of the things, like there's not, for me, it's not specific, they must have this course or that course, but I think it's the experiences that they're having in it. And I also want to really work to have it where core content educators are really thinking about SEL responses and strategies within their daily lessons. What do our check-ins look like? How are we ensuring that our students are feeling good? How do we help them navigate when anxiety or stress takes over in their lives? How do we help them think about, all of these things on their desk, and how are they orienting and organizing themselves? How are they thinking about time management? I think it was Emily or maybe Anna Sophia today at lunch who was talking about how to manage their time, and our teachers really thinking about what it's like to take an AP course, and they might be saying you have to do X, Y, and Z, but they're not taking that extra lens of teaching them or providing models of how to organize and structure their day and to consider how they're approaching their work. And so if we can really push that and have teachers thinking about that, I think oftentimes when we start to get up into the high school world, we have higher expectations for the independence of our students. And I think we have to really consider that independence, and that many students are ready for that, but some are not. And we have to remember that we have to call on our families to support our students. They are teenagers. They are children still. They need our support. Many are not ready to just leave. My own children, I wonder sometimes, but we have to support them. We have to let them fall at some points, but we have to be ready to pick them up. But we can't let them fall unless we feel secure enough that we've provided resources around the strategies that they may need as lifelong learners.
Tony, follow-up?
Thank you. You introduced some interesting ideas around students leading their own conferences, goals, and portfolios, and giving students more ownership to their education and leading their own education. What kind of steps would you take to make something like that happen? Because that's a big change. So I'm really curious about that.
Absolutely. I think the first priority is thinking about the space where that could happen. So if a school had an advisory programming, for instance, you could think about housing some of those initiatives through that advisory program. I come from a lens where there's a daily advisory, and it's a hybrid of academic, SEL, community building. And so within that world of the academic world, you can have goal setting, you can be practicing for student-led conferences, students can be culling projects and assessments from classes and bringing it to that advisory and doing some reflection work around that with an educator facilitating that. But in order to do that first, what would need to happen is that I would ask for a group of educators to come together and to think about ways that it could be piloted in maybe 1 or 2 schools in the district. I would argue, 2 of the K-8s potentially. I would ask the high school if they were interested as well. And then we would do site visits to schools that are doing the programs really well, school districts that have embedded advisory programming and/or student-led conferences and portfolios to see it in action. I think going to see it and visit and envisioning it happening is really powerful for our educators, and they come back from those site visits excited to do the work. We have also had students go on site visits as well to look at the student lens and to meet with students and actually watch passage portfolios or student-led conferences happen and be kind of visitors to that process. I think having student champions of the work is really important, and also for our caregivers to understand what it means to do that work and to be a part of it. So I think all of those steps have to happen first. You have to kind of build the capacity of buy-in and make it connected to what Somerville wants to have. You know, in the high school, I referred to the Highlander habits earlier. I think they're fantastic, and all of the things that they have lead to some of this work. If we want them to do this, it all lives in those Highlander habits, and so I think it could also be an offshoot of talking about those habits, and I also wonder how those habits live in our elementary world here in Somerville, so that students are kind of working their way up to mastering those habits when they hit high school. And then you develop the professional development around it. And so the piloting program in those schools, you're thinking about that professional development, you're thinking about how you could utilize those Wednesday afternoon PD sessions. Maybe you're thinking about starting it in grade 3, and you start there in kind of a middle years and test it out, and then develop all of the resources that go with it. And you think about just one student-led conference that year. And then next year, if you have success, you think about a fall and a spring conference. And you think about a second grade level that wants to take that on. And before that first conference hits, you think about what's the next grade level you're going to do. Are you going to drop down to, say, second grade? Are you going to think about fourth grade? Maybe you're going to do both. And so in those conferences, you identify some students who are happy to have extra visitors. If they're second grade teachers, maybe they're teachers they had, so there's a comfort level, so they can actually see it in action themselves. And so now, rather than having to do the site visit, they're doing the site visit right there in their own school. And then those teams of teachers can troubleshoot through what that could look like in designing those resources that go with it, and then eventually thinking about how a passage portfolio might look different than a student-led conference, which really is about 20 minutes. And it really just replaces the teacher conferences that we have. So rather than the teacher always sharing everything with the caregiver, the student is sharing their experience. And the educator is there to support and share maybe a little bit more details that some of our elementary tiny humans might not be able to express in terms of benchmark assessments or how they're doing with actual writing. But the students could show examples of it, and the teacher could speak to really what the process was and where their student may be and review a report card situation as well. Sure.
Ms. Dion. Your question, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, that was my question.
I think that was a follow-up.
Thank you. Ooh, Ms. Barish.
Thank you. Faculty are important stakeholders. As superintendent, how would you build a relationship with principals and building-based educators?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I want to be as visible as possible in schools. When I go into schools now and visit classrooms, I always leave a note. I have kind of Post-it note size business cards, for lack of a better term, and I always write a note to the educator when I'm there and when I leave, and I get great feedback from that, and some will follow up because I always kind of have I'm wondering about something, and they'll write back and share kind of the answer or response to the wondering, which is really great. Not everybody does, but some do, and it's really fantastic. And I think just being really present in schools is really important, and I think it also builds trust. Because what I want to be able to do for the principals and for the educators is I want to be a voice that brings to all of you as the school committee members, that I know what's happening in our schools. I am hearing from our educators. I'm seeing their action in play in real time. I'm not just hearing about it or wondering about it, but I'm there consistently. And for my building principals, I want to be somebody that they can collaborate with, that they can problem solve with, that I can do learning walks with, and really talk about the state of their building and how well it's going, where there are struggles, and really help them think about their school improvement plans, their working plans, what their goals are for the school and how they're progressing towards that. And I think when educators see that, I've implemented district learning walks in Pittsfield, and we started with just the district team in the first round, and now we just started the second round, and the second round includes the principal as it did in the first, but also members of the instructional leadership team. So they can also be a part of that process and understanding how the district is looking at classrooms and how we talk about our classrooms, and they're part of that process of thinking about how we can make our schools better and what supports do we need to provide, because it's all about us as a district on those walks. What are we not doing or providing for our educators that they need? How can we use that information from our walks to determine future professional development or future needs of a building if we're noticing that classrooms either have too many students in them or too few students, and how do we think about our resources? But in bringing in our instructional leadership teams and our educators in that process has been really helpful, and also helps for us to build community. And I think in other ways, as I mentioned with the co-teaching, when a principal is working through something and wants to try something new, for me to be a part of it and for the educators to see me being a part of it. I'm pulling together resources for them. I'm ordering books together. We're looking at these things. They're showing me maps of the classroom that they're combining in this open classroom setting, and we're problem solving through it. We're thinking about custodial needs. We're thinking about communication to families. They're sharing drafts. I'm editing, and so it's a really collaborative process. And I want them to see that I want to be a part of that, because it's the district collectively together that when our schools are successful, we in turn are successful, and that's what brings families to us.
Dr. Ackerman.
Thank you. So what you spoke about, often, based on my experience, requires subs or other people to come and be in a classroom if a teacher's doing a learning walk, things like that. My understanding is right now substitute teachers are quite hard to come by. So how do you practically keep that work going when the supports, human resource supports, might be hard to come by?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's definitely a challenge. For the instructional leadership team, we try to pull 2 to 4 educators, so it doesn't feel as much as a heavy lift, and we really only pull them for an hour and a half at a time in a school, so it's not a full day experience. And sometimes it happens where it might be during a common planning time or a prep time that we kind of give back the time to them later. But so far there hasn't been an issue. Sometimes we rely on our paraeducators in some of our spaces. They're already in those classrooms. I think in most of our schools, we kind of have at least one dedicated sub that has been coming consistently now. This is the first year, I think, since we've had that. That's been incredibly helpful. The other ways is that sometimes we can actually have deans of students. We also have teachers of department and counselors that sometimes will step in and support a space during that time. And sometimes they come on the walk with us too, which is super helpful to have that lens. But in worst case situations, it is not beside us to have one of us actually step out and cover a class, or a principal to stay back so that their teachers could come forward and they cover the class for them. But so far it's been working out okay, especially if we just limit it to 2 to 4. Some of our instructional leadership teams have 10 to 12 staff members on it, so that's been really helpful. And actually a walk that we just did this week, we had a student support para that joined us for the walk, who's a member of our instructional leadership team, and so the classroom coverage wasn't needed for that. Somebody else needed to support if there was a student call during that time.
When you have organized opportunities for students to experience learning outside when have you organized opportunities for students to experience learning outside the traditional classroom? And what are some innovative thoughts you have in this regard?
So it's a great question. When I was in Springfield for 5 years, I was a teacher in an expeditionary learning school. And in expeditionary learning schools, and then I was a principal of one for 3 years. In expeditionary learning schools, it's a heavy focus on community-based learning and the idea of field work versus field trips. So oftentimes in education, we study something in the classroom, maybe like an artist in an art class, and then we go to the museums and we see the artwork there. And in this case, we wanted students to be able to go to the museum first, wonder about the artist. What was their background? What are they picking up in the images? What are they inquiring about? So a lot of inquiry-based learning that was happening. And they were taken through certain protocols to look at, and they'd come back to the classroom, and they'd research their wonderings, their kind of hypothesis around the background of the artist, and bring that to light. But as an educator, one of the, I think, the most powerful expeditionary learning experiences that we had, which was an integrated project. We were a team-based middle school and high school setting, and so there was 4 core teachers and a special education teacher tied to a group of 80 to 100 students. And so in 8th grade, which was the founding 6th grade, became 8th graders, and I was working with them for the second time, we had a learning expedition titled Silenced Voices. And in the 8th grade social studies curriculum at the time, there was a unit around Native American history. And so we fast-forwarded the lens to Native Americans today and thinking about how their voices have been silenced over time. And I remember that one of the opening activities that we did was I asked them to draw a Native American. And many of them drew the headdress and the feathers. And I'll never forget this. A student, a wonderful student, he raised his hand and he said, "I drew a modern Native." And I said, "You did?" And so he showed it, and it was a Native American with a headdress, but in like jeans and a t-shirt, standing outside of a casino. And so we talked about these stereotypes, and we went and visited the Pequot Museum near the casino. And we researched the history, and we brought in Native American voices. And out of that work of them realizing the stereotypes they had in their minds, because to them, Native Americans didn't exist anymore. They weren't around because they didn't see the teepees and the feather headdresses anywhere. And so when we dispelled that stereotype and that myth, and they understood that they were a part of our community and lived side by side of us, we began to honor the land. And one of the things that came out of that was Indians as mascots. And so a small group of 8th grade students at the Springfield Renaissance formed the Anti-Native American Mascot Committee. And they developed a whole proposal. And they went to Turner's Falls High School, who was debating the mascot, and they were invited by the school committee to go and present. And they put together a whole presentation on why Native Americans should not be used as mascots, that no other cultural group is used as a mascot, and that the Fighting Irish, if you wanted to bring that up, was in part a celebrated and not a historically inaccurate representation. And so they presented, and the school committee voted to not have the Native American imagery. And so that was really powerful for my students. And then full circle, when I became the principal at Mohawk Trail, we went through a similar fight around the mascot. And I shared out to all my former students, here I am leading a building with Native American Plains Chief Indian in Western Massachusetts as our mascot, and it ended up being eliminated. And I used their information, their presentation, for my school and for my students, and that really leveraged change for us from our student perspective. So I think that's just one example of how you can really think about students interacting with community in research and resources. There's a whole host of others. There is a project of my students that is archived in the Library of Congress from Springfield, and it was 50 years past the civil rights movement in Springfield, and they interviewed civil rights leaders in Springfield who had been in the 60s and 70s really leading the charge. They recorded the interviews, they put together a video. It became a museum exhibit, one of the first exhibits at the new, at the time, Springfield History Museum. We had a whole opening gala for them, and they saw their work displayed as a museum exhibit, which was really fascinating. And for some reason, kind of timing was perfect. The Library of Congress was in the middle of a project of storing local history on the civil rights movement, and their project is, so if you Google the Springfield Renaissance and the Library of Congress, it will come up and you'll see that. But that was another really powerful moment for students, and that was mainly juniors in high school that were a part of that process, and the other one were 8th grade.
Okay, Ms. Krepschen?
How do you go about planning for and building a budget? With whom do you speak or consult, and what kinds of data do you use or would you use to build a budget?
Talk to as many people as possible, all kinds of stakeholders, from government officials to caregivers to community organizations. What can they offer and provide to us that maybe could be in place of something that we've been financing? To our students, what resources do they want in their schools? What is adequate or inadequate for them? To our educators, to our principals, to our school committee. But for me, I've been really trying to research and focus on equity funding and what that can look like. I think that many people confuse equity funding with equality funding and kind of a one-size-fits-all mentality. If one school gets an assistant principal of teaching and learning, they all should get that. If one school gets a math coach, they all should get that. And I think we have to prioritize what schools need. And you can do that through student-based budgeting. You can consider a system where it's weighted by, the percentage of multilingual learners or special education students, or even test scores and assessments. If a school is lagging behind maybe some other schools, and something is standing out for you in that area. So maybe it's the math scores that are standing out for you, and you think about allocation of math resources or coaches and supports, or a co-taught model in a math classroom. But I think it really has to be needs-based of that school, and you have to be really transparent and thoughtful of how you message that out, because everybody wants everything for their schools. There's no doubt about that. But if we're noticing that there's a high level of, say, disciplinary referrals in a particular school, maybe we need to think about SEL resources. Maybe it needs to be a therapeutic response versus putting a dean of students to just respond to the behaviors. But what's the next step if we think about restorative justice or practices? How are we supporting our students in that? And it doesn't just mean that we need more people to respond to the calls of removing students, but how do we support the students, and then in turn support kind of the tier 1 instruction of the classroom educators? How do we assess what their needs are and how they're working with our students? Do they have the capacity? And so then you think about professional development needs. Do we see a trend across the district, and we think about how to utilize those Wednesdays or summer sessions for additional professional development? But maybe one school needs something that another school doesn't. And so when you look and think about programming or professional development, you don't have to look at it as we're getting this for all of our district. We might just need to think about second step implementation in a couple of our schools to start. And then maybe other schools hear about it and they feel like it's a resource. But during that time, maybe we've trained our educators to become experts so they could then push into other schools and share their experiences and be coaches to their peers across the district. I think we also always have to think internally about our budget. What's our internal capacity of our staff? We have so many organizations or resources sending us emails constantly. Do you need a new building schedule? Do you need more security cameras? Do you need more of this or that? We've got the best second step program or SEL program that's out there. We have the best DEI audit that you can have. And we get tempted, right? We get tempted like, wow, I want to take a look at that. And sometimes the resource is sitting right in our spaces. And so it's really thinking about what we currently have. And maybe the resources in our community, and they'll come in and do it for us because they're a community partner to us. So I think that's when you have to really consider what are the resources you have in this area. And there are a lot of them here in Somerville for us, whether it's in our city or it's in our surrounding towns that want to help education. And if they don't, we have to help them understand they do want to help, right? Because it's only going to help us in the long run as a community and thinking about that. So, it's challenging. There's challenging times with budgets and the ESSER funding and the cliffs that everyone is worried about. And so now is the time to really have an approach where you're being thoughtful about it, where you're asking building principals to consider how these changes reflect in their school improvement plans or the goals they've set for themselves, how it connects back to a strategic plan for a district or the district improvement plan. Are things aligning? Because if you have things that are as goals as a district, but then there's no funding to support those goals, there's a mismatch that happens there. And then you can't actually do what you needed to do. And so then people are going to come back and go, well, you had this as a goal for 7 years now. Why haven't you accomplished it? And the response shouldn't be, well, we don't have the funding. If we don't have the funding, then it shouldn't be a goal. Or we have to think about a different creative way to accomplish that goal.
Sure.
So let's go in order. So I'm gonna go Ms. Pashone, then
you
you.
follow up. Okay.
Thank you. I had a specific question about what is your experience creating budgets, role, size, and scope of budget? And also, what's your, you mentioned needs-based, but student needs-based budgets. Do you have experience creating those? Thank you.
So I'll answer the last question first. So I don't have experience with that specifically. I have tried to have experience with that. Hasn't played out so well. But I've done the research and thinking about the ways that it could transform a district or the needs of a building, especially in schools where there are significant challenges or who maybe need additional support from the state, for instance. And then the first question, in terms of the experience with budgeting, so as a building principal in a rural community, you're involved in every aspect of that budgeting because the budgets are not large and there's a limited resources. So a lot of it was really thinking about what's in our general budget, what can we afford on our own, and then really thinking about, we did a whole reimagining and redesign, and it was all grant funded. And so reaching out and finding the grants to support your schools is really important. And just over or under 3 years, brought in $1 million into my 400-student high school, middle high. And that's because we were seeking things, we were being really thoughtful about what we wanted to do, but then also really thinking about not always using it for staff, right? Because that funding is going to run out. So how to build the capacity of the staff you currently have, really thinking about what you want to use that funding for. Because right now, I think so many districts have used the ESSER funding for additional staffing allocations. And now if that goes away, how do we figure out what we still need to have? And a lot of that staffing, I would argue, maybe not in Somerville, was around SEL, additional counselors in lots of places. In Pittsfield, I think we added 12 adjustment counselors to our schools that are needed, and actually more are needed. And so we have to think about ways to prioritize. So we think about class sizes, and could we consolidate in some places where maybe there's natural leave of teachers through retirement. We also have a significant number of teachers on emergency waivers and those licenses, and we're not sure if they're going to continue in the field, and so there could be some natural areas that we can offset. And so my work with the budget in terms of Pittsfield, in terms of the district-wide budget, is really thinking about helping principals navigate their approach to that budgeting and working through, and they have to kind of share out to us. They come together with the superintendent, myself, and the assistant superintendent of finance, and they talk to us about, they have to project their class sizes out. They have to project the needs that they're going to have in their building. They have to tie it back to their school improvement plans. So if there's asks that are in there, they have to provide the data and the resources to why that's a necessary ask for them. And in some cases, we say, if this is an ask, what are you going to give up instead? And they come to that with us. Many of them know their buildings really well. And then sometimes you have to have the difficult conversation. If you are an underperforming school and you want to eliminate the assistant principal of teaching and learning, help me understand how that's going to improve academic outcomes. What's the alternative? Maybe it's an additional coach instead, so that you have an ELA and a math coach, and they're going to really get into classrooms more frequently, and you're a small school and you can manage some of the observational pieces as a solo principal without an APTL. So those are some of the ways that we've been working with budget, but it is working very closely with principals, and then obviously department leads who oversee their own budgets, such as special education. And a lot of those are titles or grants that come through, and so it's not as, I think, daunting as a task as it is for building principals when we say, well, you have 50 less students next year, and we've got to think about considerations. And as I mentioned throughout the day today, different than Somerville, Pittsfield has a declining population. And so we have some schools that have class sizes of 12 in our elementaries, and 3 rooms of 12 students in a grade level. And so sometimes we have to have those hard decisions. We've been used to that staffing level, but that is not the norm, and that class size of 18 is still okay if you have to make a reduction. And in some cases, that educator might be able to go to a different space. It does not always mean that that's a cut that actually happens. Sure.
Mr. Young?
I had the same question. It's been answered. Okay. Thank you.
Well, okay, so I have one more follow-up, although I also had that one as well, so thank you. So you mentioned in the beginning, talk to as many people as possible, and the expression is, equity isn't pie, there's room to go around, but time often is. There's only so much time. And so if you're making time or if you try to make time to hear from voices that may not otherwise be heard, that time has to come from somewhere.
Yes.
And people may feel that loss. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so I think you have to have a very strong budget calendar. And it's so stressful to think about starting the budget calendar in early December, but in some ways you have to do that. One of the things that Pittsfield has been doing the past 2 years, which I think is really great, is that they've been doing budget workshops with the school committee. 3-hour sessions where building principals and district leaders are together talking about priorities in terms of budgeting, concerns, areas for growth, which is a way to allow school committee to start to begin to think about what we're considering in terms of the budget moving forward, and then school committee members can begin to have conversations with their constituents as well. But in that budget calendar is where you would have those touch points laid out from, say, December to February or March, where you would have open forums, sessions. You want to have it built out so that you could have interpreters and resources. You also want to think about the location for that. Are there community organizations that you want to go to and have those conversations so that you can try to get to as many folks as possible, and maybe people that aren't typically at the table for you, and in more kind of school-based settings or meetings such as this. And then also scheduling the time with staff, open sessions for staff to come, for them to hear about what you're thinking about the budget, or even just kind of talking about a state of the budget for the next year, thinking about that financial cliff that may happen with ESSER, and the reality of it, and what do they prioritize as needs for themselves as schools and for educators, thinking about conversations with union leadership. But to have that really identified calendar in advance, and then really kind of thinking about that time you're going to present to the city council for their approval, and really kind of backwards mapping it so you can have those touch points, and then be able to say, we've spoken and we've heard and we've provided opportunities, even if it's just a survey after the fact that they could complete, or even recording yourself in a Zoom session now talking about it. You could have an open Zoom session and then record that, and that could be shared on a district website, and people could review it, review the budget presentation at their leisure, which everybody wants to do, but they'd have that opportunity if they couldn't watch it live, which, some people do, and,
Oh, yes.
but it's there.
They do. Ms. Barish.
Thank you. You mentioned considering the location as one strategy for reaching out to groups that may not show up, for example, here. Sure. Could you talk about other strategies you have for reaching populations that, we don't typically hear from?
Yeah, I think it's, you have a lot of different resources, even just in the Somerville district, if it's, the family center and those resources. And so, wanting to reach out to those entities to then figure out the ways that where can we go to have these conversations, whether it's setting up in the library, setting up at the family center, setting up at a church even. Where do people congregate and gather? Whether it's at a park, pickleball's becoming really popular. Is that a popular thing here? Do you show up there and start to have some conversations? So, I think that's a strategy. I also think about trying to have principals identify key caregivers that we should reach out to directly and say, we really want to have your voice on this. But I think the important thing is trying to understand, and this is where part of the work that I would do if I was here is understanding why some members of historically resilient communities are not participating, and how might they participate if something was different for them. And so really getting to the root of that. And I think that our community partners can help in that. I also think there's plenty of staff at our schools that have really deep connections with our caregivers, and might be able to bridge that connection from scary central office and the superintendent wanting to talk with them, and to set up a system where they could be there as well to support. So if there's family liaisons in schools, can they help run sessions with us so that there's a sense of comfort for our families in that process?
Thank you.
Dr. Ackman?
Thank you. So in reaching out to historically resilient communities, I'm going to attempt to adopt that. I appreciate it. In my own experience doing so, there are times where I've heard feedback that parents are looking for things from the schools, from their kids, that are not in line with sort of where we're moving as a district. how do you engage on, because, you know, you want them to feel welcome, you want them to feel heard, but how do you engage when what, and really whoever it is, like when someone is asking you for something that the district isn't going to provide?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're in a forum and that's coming up, for me, it's really about just listening and understanding, because there may be an idea presented that we haven't considered as a district. Maybe a family's coming from a different state with a different lens, and maybe it's something we should consider. So we don't want to ever just say, we're not going to. For me, the forums are really about listening, presenting our ideas, sharing them, but then really listening. And then having a follow-up conversation with a family if I feel as though this is not going to work, because for whatever reason, you know, what they're asking for is just not a reality, because it either doesn't align or it's not fiscally possible for us to do at this time. And having more of a one-on-one conversation to work through it. And maybe there's an element of something in there that maybe isn't exactly what they presented. Maybe they didn't know something else already existed in the system that could replace it, and having that more informal process with them together versus a formal presentation and process, because having kind of the back and forth with community members in a forum will eliminate time for others to participate in that. So for me, I really look at them as listening sessions and then reaching back out to families who have really presented something that they feel very passionate about, and it's kind of like, I want this or else type thing, or they had a really awesome idea and I want to hear more about it and wonder how maybe it could be something that we could bring to Somerville. I think, you know, I always say, and I said this in my first interview, that, you know, in education, it's really, I think, the only field that the majority of people feel like an expert in it, because most of us have gone through school ourselves. And so we feel like we know what school is and how school works and what it needs to be or what it doesn't need to be. And so we're always up against that, that everybody has an expertise from their own educational experience, and so can really speak to things and get really passionate about it. And I'm the same way, even with my own children, and I know I shouldn't be that way. I have to like take a step back, you know, and I'm sure all of you do that as well too. But we have to also realize that there are limitations sometimes with public education of what you're able to do, either because of staffing levels, spacing levels, or just the financial obligations that you have as a district tied to lots of different programs.
So if in listening sessions, you're hearing ideas that are either implicitly or explicitly like homophobic or racist or prejudiced in some other way, how do you address that?
I say it is. Okay. Homophobic, racist, and not acceptable, and the Somerville Public Schools will not tolerate this conversation.
Okay. So my next question is mine. Last question of this round. What is your vision for supporting the success of multilingual learners?
It's a great question. I think in looking at what Somerville has already started to do and the different programs that you have, you're well on your way to providing supports and resources for all students, no matter how they enter the district and where they are. But I think most importantly, we need to get stronger as a nation at the classroom level of how we support and welcome students into our spaces. I think that really comes from professional development, which I think does not occur as often as it does, say, for special education students, as it should for multilingual learners. I think, again, it's another area that we rely on the educators tied to multilingual learners and hope that they will just do it. And that educators, classroom educators, are nervous about how to approach it and how to do that, especially, you know, if it is a newcomer who does not have, you know, a hold of the English language, and the teacher does not speak their language. And so there just creates this barrier to begin with that people get nervous about, nervous to make a mistake, nervous to engage, nervous to make the student feel maybe embarrassed, and they're all valid responses. But then what happens to that is that our students feel ignored and not seen. And so at the classroom level, we have to really think about ways that we can provide the professional development, the tools and resources for our educators to both teach the academics, but then also create spaces of community for our students. Somerville is really an incredible district with a high percentage of multilingual learners, but I've been in districts where the student may be the one student in their grade level that does not speak the language that their peers do. And so how do you really navigate building community? And in some ways, it's really thinking about strategic partners of students, buddies in that system, really thinking about how our counselors are engaging with our students. But I think, in the long run, in terms of the programming and the outlets, it really should not be any different than what the experiences are of our students who are not multilingual learners. So we want to make sure that the programming does not limit their ability to participate in music or arts programming or for clubs and other activities. So we don't want it to be replaced by something else, which can be really challenging in a building-based schedule. But I think it's absolutely doable, and it shouldn't be things that only happen after school. It has to be embedded in the day. Pulling students from their either specials in elementary or electives at the secondary level is not okay on a regular basis. Periodically, maybe it's an every other day piece that happens, but so much richness and academic achievement can be gained by students in spaces like theater and performing arts, visual or musical classes. So much can be gained by that. And for the peers, their connection to all of that actually increases in music that they're listening to, shows that they're watching, the way they can interact and play at recess together. Some of the games are the same across the globe, that they can engage in and participate in. And so really thinking also about how play can come into part of the academic success of students ultimately, because they feel a sense of belonging and a sense of community, which is important for any person. We all want that. But imagine sitting in a space where you don't know what is being said all of the time, or you're not picking up on the sarcasm of another student. It's not making sense to you, or a phrase that we use in the United States that isn't used other places, and so then it doesn't translate well, in their brains. And so really being mindful of that and thinking about ways that we could build that in for our students in terms of lessons to support around cultural awareness and culturally responsive teaching practices.
Ms. Petone, you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the reference to sort of the personal experience and the cultural sensitivity, as well as avoiding the exclusion of students, particularly like they get pulled out for their support versus going to their art class. But systemically, what policies, programs, and structures need to be in place to ensure equitable learning opportunities for multilingual learners?
Yeah, I think you have to really consider the levels of students that you have, considering a newcomer program, even just the way that we enroll our students and what that looks like. And I don't know what that looks like here at Somerville. I know you have a strong enrollment office that is probably doing an incredible job with that. But really even thinking about the community resources that we tie in that enrollment process so that our families feel connected to it. And then I think in terms of programming, it really is thinking about the data and supports that our students need and outlining that school by school. We don't want to have our multilingual learners have a different experience across the district, some being excluded, some being included, some receiving the services that they need and some not. I think it really needs to, in some ways, almost function like special education, where there is a plan for our students when they're coming in. So if at this point, if their access test is telling us this, then we need to ensure that this is happening. And how do we use the data to support that? How do we think about models that other strong districts are using to ensure that learning outcomes are both equitable and attainable for multilingual learners? And it all kind of goes back also to that universal design for learning and really thinking about there's so many strategies between multilingual learners and special education learners that benefit all students, and we just don't think that way. And we have to really think that way, that giving a sentence starter to someone is actually super helpful to everyone in the space. And why is that such a bad thing to do? And it's almost, I sometimes wonder about a bank of accommodations or modifications for multilingual learners that could be used by teams of teachers to really think about for a particular student based on their profile. We have to get, I think, in my opinion, more individualized when we're working with our multilingual learners, similar to how we work with special education students, because each student's experience is unique, each student's background, depending on where they came from, even if they're all coming from, say, Columbia, but then different cities or villages have different educational experiences and outcomes and expectations, and not just making assumptions that they're coming from Columbia and this was their experience, but really thinking about the profile, getting to know, like, what is that intake process? How do we look at the transcripts of students? I think that should be all, not that it has to be policy, but part of a process in that enrollment, so we can really understand, were there any gaps in that learning? What does the school year look like of where they were coming from? How many hours a day? Maybe what they were studying, which are some things that you can gather from a transcript once it's been translated, but also really making sure that you're placing students appropriately, because sometimes those transcripts may look like a student has accomplished, say, grades 6 and 7, but really they haven't yet. So really making sure you understand that you're putting them in the right space so they feel comfort in that as well. Sure.
Okay, that wraps up, believe it or not, round 1. So at this point, we'll turn it over to members for round 2. Dr. Phillips.
I believe you received a copy of the school committee goals. Awesome. In what ways has your background prepared you to help us achieve these goals? And with which goals or objectives do you have the least prior experience? And how will you ensure we meet them too?
Thank you for that question. So I think, I've talked a little bit about, I think, each of these this evening, but I think the whole child teaching and learning is really just super important for our students and ultimately for the community at large. We're developing humans ultimately, and they spend more time with us than they do with their families, and so we have a really important job to do for our students, for them to be successful, but also for our community in the long run. And I really appreciate that you have some of these surveys that students are completing, and I think if there aren't school-based surveys that really speak to a sense of belonging and engagement, how are our students viewing their day? How deeply connected are they to the curriculum, to the resources there, and our educators? I think that is really important. So, and that gives us a sense of how they can be stronger for our students. So while we have whole child teaching and learning, I think we also have to have an element of focus on our educators that are working directly with our students. So do they feel a sense of belonging in their own schools? Do they feel supported? Do they feel engaged in the process? So that, I think I have a strong background in really thinking about that and engaging in that process, that it's not just about academic achievement. It really is about developing humans that will be compassionate, that will be equity-minded when they leave us, and have a better sense of how the world can be more accepting and enriching for the entire community. I think equitable access to programming, that's another area that I've had some experience with. You have, I think, an embedded honors kind of system that's happening in the high school, and we had to do something similar with Mohawk Trail. Not that we had to, but part of it was around how to schedule students with such a small high school. But we also were noticing that there was disproportionate number of special education students who were not enrolling in honors courses. And when I had a conversation with a math teacher, and when I asked what the difference was between their honors class and their non-honors, and they just said pace. It wasn't about going deeper. It wasn't about more inquiry. It was about just going faster. And I thought, well, that doesn't feel very honors to me. Honors to me feels like digging deeper into something, problem solving, approaching it differently. And so that's when we really started to have some significant conversations about what our programming is and how all students could access the curriculum together. And so we did an embedded honors program where students could opt into honors assessments and resources, because think about it, DESE doesn't have separate honors standards, right? It's just algebra standards, it's just chemistry standards. But schools somehow have developed this honors system or this AP system, and students feel obligated to. I can't remember which student today, if it was Emily or not, that mentioned at lunch when we asked the question around why AP, and they talked about to raise their GPA, mostly. And it wasn't about the work or the approach. It was about, I want that increase. And that just feels off to me in that system. It doesn't feel like that's what it was meant to do. And I think some schools are doing that as a way to kind of honor students taking AP courses. And it's not just about the rigor of the curriculum and the internal desire to do that and to feel the pride in doing that. And so I think that's worrisome for me, and I'd want to consider that. And so that equitable access, really thinking about who are the students sitting in our different classrooms and what are they experiencing? Who are our students in CTE programming? I was looking at some of the numbers of Somerville, and Pittsfield has the same thing of thinking about, cosmetology and not that I want to use gender, but male to female ratios, and predominantly what has been female programs, or how many students who identify as female are in plumbing or going to go into HVAC, and trying to break down some of those barriers, or how many special education students are we pushing into CTE when maybe that's not the pathway, but we have some bias around that. And so I think that's also something that we have to be considering and thinking about. And then also, if there are, say, academic skills classes or ways that students aren't able to access some of the electives programming or arts programming, to ensure that there's a way that we're breaking down that barrier to that. Workforce diversity, this is always, such an area of concern, and we need more representation of BIPOC educators, LGBTQ+ educators, but it's trying to figure out how we compete with the private sector, because everyone now wants a diverse workforce. And so how can we compete when the private sector may be paying 2 to 3 times as much as we are? So how do we figure out that way? And it's still in the work. I am not an expert on it, but how do we think about our students? I had a really great conversation a couple of weeks ago with one of our students at one of our high schools that is the kind of leader of Advancing Minds of Color. And he was talking about how he really wants to see students thinking about career pathways in education. And so we began to talk about that. How could we assign teacher mentors to students that are showing an interest in education, especially students of color, and to really kind of cultivate that relationship, maybe having them do internships in that teacher's classroom, even if it's at the elementary level. Similar to Somerville, we have an early childhood CTE program, but what we find often is that students leave and graduate, and then they're going to work for the private sector, and they're not going on to get that teaching license. So how could we cultivate that more for our students? And then obviously considering, our workforce currently, from anybody from, bus ops to cafeteria to paraprofessionals that maybe want to advance, and how can we partner with colleges around that piece. Retention is really important in that. And so, how could we use affinity groups? We're trying to figure out ways that there's a shared sense of community when we don't have as many educators of color in Pittsfield, or educators that identify as LGBTQ or have the intersectionality of both. So how to create spaces for them where they feel seen and heard and supported in that process. I am no expert on how to do that well. I think we're trying to kind of throw lots of things out there because it's a challenging place to be right now in a world where, which is great, people are focusing on equity and diversity and inclusion, but now we're really at odds with the corporate world, and it's hard to be an educator today. It is stressful and people are leaving the field, but I think if we could really start with our students and cultivate that and really harness that, that might give us some leverage. And I think even for our families coming in, when I was in Springfield and we had the Somali program in my building, our Somali para was an educator in Somalia. And so they didn't have access to the licensure and things here. And so I always think back to him, and I wonder if we had done a better job of supporting him in trying to access. So how many families are coming in where they were educators in a different country, but don't know how to access the licensure here, and so really trying to have some movement around that as families are coming in and getting that background. oh, sorry, there's one more. Equitable resource allocation, I think I've talked a little bit about that. So, I think your goals they're outstanding and ambitious, absolutely, but necessary to drive the work, I think, of a district.
Is this a follow-up or, okay.
During the community forum, you were asked a question about buildings and infrastructure, which is part of our goals. Can you speak to your experience? Can you repeat what you said in the community forum and speak to your experience building, renovating, creating new buildings?
Yeah, so I'll be very honest up front. I haven't been in the process of start to finish of a new building project. I arrived in Pittsfield a few years after a brand new high school was built, and so now we're going through the growing pains, as I think you're starting to go through, of wow, we shouldn't have designed it that way, or we didn't think this all the way through. And similar to the high school, we have like the open bathroom situation, and so different things like that, or just passing times, or thinking about the length of a hallway you would have to walk to get from one space to another if there was a concern call that happens, or Wi-Fi issues in the building. And now what we're experiencing as there's CTE programs in that space as well, is that a lot of the equipment is starting to lose its life already 4 or 5 years in, and the warranties are up. I think they're up in 4 years. And now, gone are the days of my grandfather's GE era where my mom had her GE dryer for 35 years, and I think corporations are on to like, oh, well, if I just make this with a lifespan of like 5 to 7, they're gonna buy another one, right? Because the repair cost is just as much as a new one. And so we're seeing that happen in CTE, and so now we have to really think about what our budget is for that repair work, and that wasn't necessarily a consideration we thought about this early on in the stage. And so there's some of that that's happening, or even just some, and Mr. Mazza and I talked a little bit about this today with cameras. We have that same situation of, well, we thought this was enough cameras, but now that we're in this space and we're thinking about it, it might not be enough for the space, or the way that there's different access points for students, things you just didn't take into consideration all the way through. When I was in Duggan, I had a renovation project happening at Duggan Middle School in Springfield. That happened as I was first becoming a principal there. I was an assistant principal and then principal, and what was supposed to be a spring to end of summer project went probably into November with lots of windows. It was an exterior facelift of the building and lots of new windows going in. And so we were in the middle of construction when the school year started. And so we had to like navigate around classes in different spaces, construction workers hanging in windows outside of the classrooms. And so we thought about ways to like kind of integrate lessons around the construction that was happening. I interviewed and without no windows in my office, and leaves were flying in at the candidates as we were doing this, and so we kind of just made do and kind of laughed through it, but I was part of that building process. And then when I was in Amherst, there was consideration for moving 6th graders into the middle school. It was a 7-8 middle school, and possibly moving 8th graders out into the high school. And so we met with an architect and a member of that architecture firm that had the education background. He was connected to the high-tech high schools out in San Diego, and really thinking about technically a lot of what you built around kind of open spaces and 21st century school spaces, of how we could kind of retrofit sections of Amherst High School for 8th graders and what that might mean. So I was part of all of those kind of planning conversations. We ended up not moving forward with it. Bless you. And there's still a lot of talk around building movements in Amherst all these years later as well, but part of those initial conversations of just considerations. And with that, you have to really think about learning. Where does learning happen, and how does it happen, and what does it look like in the spaces? So I think you also, for consideration of that, really need to have educators as part of that, both the design aspect, walking through, visualizing it. It's actually what we did with the co-teachers at the elementary school I'm supporting. They built out a map of it's an open classroom school. And so they're taking down the barriers to their spaces, but we're mapping it out and really thinking about, and they did it on a Friday afternoon. They tore their classroom apart and set it up as they thought, and then walk themselves through the different stations of how they could be co-teaching together, and then they put it all back together again. But then they revised it because they're like, ooh, we didn't think about this, or if we needed to have a safety drill, where would the students go now? Some of the things that we had to kind of problem solve around. So always having, if I was just doing that myself, I wouldn't have that lens. So I think really making sure that educators are part of the process when you're thinking about renovation or building new structures. Sure.
Ms. Dion.
I have a follow-up question. You talked about the embedded honors program that you were a part of, and we've been in the process of possibly restructuring our math curriculum to be something similar. I'm wondering, what subjects did you do embedded honors classes in, and could you give us an example of like a specific assignment, what the workload was like for the honors students versus for the rest of the students in the class?
Sure. So we did it in all subject areas, and we probably wouldn't have necessarily always started off that way, but because we were a small high school, you know, we had class sizes that averaged around 60 students in a grade level. So it was quite small, and it was hard to program students into all the courses and to run the courses. So they had as many opportunities as a Somerville high school student would. And it's also important to know we did have advanced placement courses as well, so students could move into that. So I give the example of an English class, and a teacher did this really well, of thinking about digging deep into the curriculum, say with an essay assignment for students. For some students, it was a simple prompt that they were given to respond to. And for honor students, it was taking that further with a different approach. Really thinking about Bloom's taxonomy comes into play for us, and really the analysis of the literature came into play for honor students versus responding to a prompt about the novel, for instance. So really the analysis is what really drove the honors work, I would say, in the English classes. And for the math classes, the challenge was the multiple approaches to problem solving. So we use inquiry-based math programming. We had shifted to that. And so many students were very fixated on, I want a formula, and I want to just put the formula in, and I want the output to it. And while that worked for many students, for our honors students, we really wanted to have them problem solve multiple different ways, and then collaborate and talk about their learning. So we really increased the academic discourse piece in our math classes when we shifted to the embedded honors and the inquiry-based math, so that students could work together and say, well, and then the teacher could say, if you solved it this way, you're going to go over to this group who solved it that way, and then you're going to show and demonstrate and support one another. So a lot of modeling was also happening in that space.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Is this a new question or a follow-up? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Patel.
Thank you. I'm going to do my best to articulate this question, and it's partially driven by nervousness in the community, nervousness from educators. You've been a leader in a building, multiple buildings. You spent less than 2 years as a deputy in an urban but a lot of rural experience. When you were applying to Pittsfield originally for the superintendent position, one of the important factors to the school committee was that you were from Pittsfield and you really wanted to be in Pittsfield. That was the message that was, I listened to some of the deliberations, and people were very impressed with you, but that was a piece of it for them. So these are the things that people are nervous about. And as a school committee member, I'm wondering myself, like, why would I want to take a chance on you as being a leader? And, what are your gaps, experience gaps? What are you nervous about if you launch into this? And at the same time, address some of these nervousness of our community and address some of these concerns.
Sure.
So I apologize, there was a little fumbling, but.
And hopefully I answer it correctly, so just let me know if you feel like something's
if I have other
missing.
questions.
Okay, great. So in terms of having only been a deputy for, this is the second year, I think, yeah, of course that's a concern. I think that in terms of rural education, one thing that many folks do not know is that central offices in rural districts are quite small. And so building principals are really involved in every level of education in that process. So in many ways, we felt like members of the district team because of the decisions that need to be made, such as being at the table for collective bargaining, and making curricular decisions and budgeting decisions, and really always being at school. We went to every school committee meeting. We were part of it. We presented at every school committee, school updates, et cetera. And in terms of, so I feel as though I've been a district leader for the past 8 years. So I think that that is really important to understand, versus when I was a principal in Springfield. I had no part of any of that. We didn't go to school committee meetings. We weren't involved in the budgeting process. We weren't involved in collective bargaining. We were kind of told this is the staffing level you're going to get this year, and we really didn't have much say in some of those pieces. So we were kind of just in our buildings getting directives. You're going to implement this program and do that program, and have this schedule, and everything is going to kind of be the same across the building. So when I went into Mohawk Trail, the learning curve was, wow, I haven't put together a school budget in the same way. I'm not sure how to think about a K through 12 trajectory for our students. And those are all things that I had to do in that setting. So for the 5.5 years that I was there, that was really deeply rooted in that work. And I think what I'm gathering from the piece around Pittsfield is the excitement to return home, but now not staying. Is that okay, clarification? Great question. And I think the simple answer is sometimes you can't go home again.
Meaning it wasn't what you expected, or what were you expecting out of that?
Yeah, I think, I'm going to choose not to answer that because I want to be very thoughtful of my community. If that's okay.
No, I respect that. Can I shift a little bit?
Sure. I'll just say this. It wasn't what I expected it to be, and the focus is not where it should be. And that's what I'll say about that.
So going back to kind of what do you see as your experience gaps?
Oh, yeah.
This kind of role, and then what are you nervous about?
Yeah, I think I'd be nervous about the gaps of not having enough of a lens on the history of Somerville coming into it. So, and I had that similar experience at Mohawk Trail because I didn't know much about it when I joined that community, and so it's a lot of learning. And so that's where I'd have to make up for some of those gaps. I think the other gaps that I would have is really working with a city council around the budgeting process. The role of the superintendent in Pittsfield and the business manager, the assistant superintendent for business, that is their function and their role. And while I'm a part of the budget development, those kind of individual conversations with city councilors, the presentation to city council, I'm not really part of that process. I'm there to support it, maybe answer questions that are specific to my office. But the development of it, that really lives in the superintendent's world and the assistant superintendent. So that, I think, would be the biggest piece is learning how to navigate that and be a little bit more of a politician than I am right now. Not that that's a term, but it is. It's role, right? It's a public role as a superintendent, and you have to build those relationships and understand that and get a sense of where counselors think and what their history has been in their approach to schooling. Because for me as a superintendent, I have to be a champion of the work of the schools. And I have to navigate when we want to do something as a school district, we want to be innovative, we want to maybe do things differently, we want to ask for something different. I have to be able to message that in a way that is very clear to the city council and to the community so that we fully understand and support it. I think Somerville is really a unique place, and what I keep hearing prior to this and all day today is the commitment to education and the passion for the education in the Somerville Public Schools. And so how do I keep that going? Because at some point there's going to be a rub. A rub is going to happen. There's going to be a pause. There's going to be a, nope, we give, and now we're stopping. And how do we keep that moving? And that's really for the betterment of the community at large. Sure.
All right, I have a follow-up to that. You know, when I look at your resume, impressive in a number of ways, obviously, but I do see that your experience is all secondary. Can you speak to how you will learn about the elementary experience?
Yeah, I think in my role right now as the deputy, I spend most of my time in elementary schools because of that. I go on learning walks with building principals so that I can understand the approach of the curriculum. I work closely with the curriculum director to really understand elementary level programming. It doesn't hurt that my wife's an elementary principal, so I also ask her for advice into insights of what students are able to do and accomplish. I think that elementary education is a high priority. I want to make that very clear. I think that the more that we can do in pre-K to 1 is going to be highly beneficial for our district. Many school districts try to prioritize the high school years, and even organizations like the Bar Foundation prioritize high school redesign and high school grants. And I understand that because there's a sense of this is where I graduated from. I'm an alumni of Somerville High School. They may not refer back to I went to East or I went to this or that. The same way I'm a Pittsfield High graduate, and I don't really, always harp on, I went to Egremont and I went to Herberg. I'm a Pittsfield High general through and through. And so I think, though, that oftentimes we then don't think about the early grades and the push that we need to have, and now we're constantly playing catch up in the secondary grades. So I try to prioritize that and to really understand the lens, to understand pre-K inclusion models, to think about the different interventions and benchmark assessments that students are doing, and really trying to understand what is a third grade capable of doing, what is a fourth grader capable of doing, and if we're not able to accomplish that for our students, what else do we need for our educators to get there? And so, yes, I don't come from an elementary background. I come from a secondary background, but I've been doing a lot of work as the deputy to really understand the elementary role.
Thank you. Ms. Dion.
How would a teacher who works under your leadership describe you?
Great sense of humor would be the first. I think people have a fun time. I think they would also say I have high expectations, that I'm really passionate about distributive leadership, that I want teachers to feel like they're on a team with me and that I value their voice. I think that is incredibly important for them. I think they would say that I'm student-driven and that decisions are made based on what the needs of the students are, as much as that can be difficult for educators to hear sometimes when they're feeling challenged by something. My pushback is always what is best for our students in this moment. And I think they would also say that I'm innovative and really want to provide the best school that we can possibly have for our students and also for our staff. It is very important for me that staff culture is high and that people feel connected to their administration, because I think oftentimes people don't always feel connected to their principals. Maybe they don't even see them. And so I really try to prioritize how I am thinking about ways in which my educators feel a sense of community and belonging. Oftentimes it is through that distributive leadership model. We embedded collegial conversations so that members of our instructional leadership team could really lead their colleagues in conversation about issues connected to education, and it's all rooted from them. And then also just the innovation, like dream big. What do we want to do? How can we do this? If it sounds like a good idea, let's problem solve and figure out a way that we can actually do it. And I think in terms of like at a district level, that I'm present, that I'm visible, and that I'm wondering constantly about their spaces and about students. And that even at the district level, I'm trying to make as much possible connection to students as I can and to hear their voice, because we work for them, ultimately. Thank you. Sure.
You already had one question at the time, right? Yeah. All right, so I'm asking next, unless Ms. Barish or Ms. Krepshin. All right, so my question, and then I'll get back to you. So I noticed in your resume, I see restorative justice stuff. I've read some of your anti-racism writings. And then I see that you also are an ALICE facilitator. Mm-hmm. And I want to know if you could speak to your relationship to ALICE, how you may feel it speaks relative to your other more restorative justice thinkings, and your thoughts what that means going forward in this district.
Sure.
It is I don't actually, because I'm not sure I would do it, be neutral and accurate in my description. So I'll ask you also to explain what ALICE is.
So ALICE training, ALICE is an approach particular to school lockdowns if there's a danger in the space. And so it's a process that classes and students go through in order to deal with a situation if there is an intruder in the building or if there's a safety issue. So I'm an ALICE trainer because our district is ALICE-based, and that is where our safety drills happen. We have a relationship with the Pittsfield Police Department, who are also trained in ALICE lockdown procedures, and so we do lockdown drills multiple times a year in addition to medical drills. And so I was trained in ALICE in both Amherst and then again in Pittsfield, because both of those districts took on the ALICE training as part of the district approach to lockdown and safety drills. Ultimately, in an ALICE situation, you would use the use of radios in the classroom to identify where a possible intruder is, and then classroom teachers would make decisions on whether or not they wanted to leave and exit. So if it was happening in the west wing of a building and you were situated on the far east wing and you could have easy access to an outlet, you would leave and go to a designated area far away from the school that it's already been predetermined and worked on with teachers, because through these drills and practices you have done that. And in other cases, if you feel like the intruder is near, you would arm with whatever you have, a book, a stapler, and be ready to respond to it, rather than sit and wait for somebody to possibly enter. I mean, there's a lot more to it in that, but that's just the kind of simplistic pieces of it. I see it as different than restorative justice. It's a response to intruders and danger in the building. I think restorative justice practices are really about student or staff behaviors in a space that violate your code of conduct or your expectations for students, and you're thinking about ways to repair the harm, whereas ALICE training is really about either an internal force or an external force that is looking to harm individuals in the building and may have weapons on them, and how we respond to that as a school.
I'm going to follow up, actually, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So do you believe we should be instructing students to fight back, or is this something you think is a teacher and staff training?
Or if I think it's a teacher or staff training?
Yeah, sure. Do you think we should be training students and having trainings for students on fighting back in active shooter situations?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say for ALICE, you don't train all students. It's usually upper grades of students that may be involved in that. I honestly would have to do research on and understand in the community. I wouldn't say I'm going to bring ALICE to Somerville. I would never say that. I would wonder what the procedures and practices would be if somebody entered the school building with a gun. I would ask that and wonder that, because I think that is a concern of community members and our staff and our students, and that I would assess and determine that. But I think that is a case where you also have to work with your local law enforcement and or state police, because they are also the people who would be responding to the incident. And so they also should be well aware of what your safety plans are, so that they can support in that process. Are they going to have individuals fleeing the building? Are they going to have to worry about that? Because what if the individual that you're looking for is also fleeing the building at the same time with all the other students? So there's a lot that has to go into it, and the approach has to be led by the district with involvement of local law enforcement to determine what your approach needs to be. ALICE is what I am familiar with and what we have been utilizing. Do I think that students should take on intruders? No. Do I think that students would? Yes.
Thank you.
Not all students would. It becomes that fight or flight mode, I believe.
All right, round 3.
This is a good follow-up, and a question I was texted earlier today. What is your experience with policing in schools and safety?
Sure. So I will speak from the standpoint of an administrator or district leader in terms of school resource officers. When I was in Springfield, there was the Quebec unit, so I was assigned a school resource officer in my building. And then when I was in Amherst and Mohawk Trail, we did not have school resource officers in our building. So if there was a need for an officer because of a violation of the law that was outside of the school world, we would just call for access to a local law enforcement. In Pittsfield, this has come up as a debate, and it has been. We currently have a safety group working on it. We do have resource officers in our middle and high schools. I think in terms of policing in schools, I'm always wondering why. Why is there a need to have police in schools? Where does that come from? Where does that stem from? I think a lot of the movement in the past 20 years has been because of school shootings. I think we have also seen in some school situations where there have been armed security officers or police that they have in fact left the building and did not stay to support. And so you cannot always guarantee that somebody will in a situation as dire as some of the things that we have seen. So for me, it really is about what is the purpose of policing. I would like to also understand how does the local law enforcement, the Somerville Police Department, see policing in schools. Ultimately, police cannot assist in most of the things that happen in schools anyway. And so most of the times the incidents are things that have been somewhat handled, and a call to the police department with somebody to come as quickly as they could, and in a city this size, they would get there rather quickly, I would assume. For me, I would question whether there is a need for police in the Somerville Public Schools. And if there is, what is the purpose of that? Is it to build community? Is it to build relationships and try to make them better relationships than what exists in our country in terms of our police right now and historically resilient communities? And if so, is there a need for uniformed police officers to be in buildings? Do they need to be armed? Can they be plain clothes? Can they just be known who they are? How do they build community in the space? But it's not my question to answer. It's the community's question to be a part of and to respond to of what is the need and then what does it look like? Because again, police are not going to respond when a student needs to be removed from a classroom because they're disruptive in the space. They're not going to respond when there's a fight in the cafeteria. That's not their role, nor should it be. That's why we have building administrators, deans of students, vice principals to support that. So I have worked in buildings where there was no police and we were okay, and I've worked in buildings where there were police and we were okay.
Ms. Patel?
Thank you. Tell me about a time when you became leader of an established team. What did you do in an effort to create a shared sense of purpose and develop into a high-functioning team? What worked and what didn't work?
Of an established team?
Yes.
Okay. So I will talk about just, coming into Pittsfield, there was an established team. The majority of people there had been working there for many years. And so I had to really build the capacity to understand each person individually. So I always started off by having one-on-one conversations with the district leads, the department directors, as well as the building principals, to really get a sense of what their thoughts were around both their role, the challenges within their role, and the successes within their role as well. And then also asking them, how do they envision me supporting their role and their work? And also, whether or not in the past, the role of the deputy was not helpful, and why not, and how could we change that? And then just really trying to build a sense of regular communication and meeting times. So now I work monthly with the directors, and we thoughtfully plan for the next month's professional development opportunities for principals, and really think about how we can align that. I also really think we've been working hard to try to break down silos within our departments, so that we're not just thinking about special education as a standalone, but also how special education intersects with curriculum, how it intersects with social emotional learning, and trying to get the directors to be a part of that process because they had lived in isolation for so long. I think the challenges that have come from that is just the systemic nature of the siloing of the departments, and also because they have folks working underneath them as well that aren't necessarily at our meetings. So there sometimes is a disconnect with coordinators as part of those meetings, and not thinking, oh, I should also invite a special education coordinator when we're thinking about a math pilot and we're having conversations around that. So it's really trying to troubleshoot through some of that. Like, we started off really strong in it, and then as the next year kicked in, it was kind of like amnesia, and we kind of forgot about it. So it's trying to get back into that and really push that. And also support one another at meetings that we're each facilitating. We're trying to get better at that, joining curriculum meetings when maybe we didn't necessarily have to be there in that moment. And I know our special education director is really making a point to be at curriculum meetings more frequently so that she can really understand the considerations for teaching and learning, and then to also bring that special education lens to it so that we ensure that students and educators are really understanding how special education can interact within these programs and curricular resources that we're identifying. Sure.
Any more questions? I have one more, but actually, I have two more, so I'll go ahead with this one. Again, it's one of those constituent concern questions. If you go to the opposition research firm or Google, a call for an audit about your hiring practices at Mohawk came up. Sure. Can you speak to that situation and tell us a little bit more about?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak a lot to it because it's a personnel. I definitely ensure that educators are licensed. In this particular situation, the superintendent was the person in the Mohawk Trail that was the final say on who was hired in these positions, so we could make recommendations. It was not just my building that had an unlicensed administrator. We also had 2 building principals that were hired and unlicensed, and in their contracts, it was a requirement that they be licensed by a certain date, of which all of them obtained that licensure. So there was a contractual obligation that they needed to be licensed. I think it was by March of the following year. And my staff member was licensed by October because they were already in the process of obtaining that licensure, and they were just waiting. They had to submit documentation to the state and get a response back. So in terms of that, that's what I can speak to. I can't speak to information regarding who put that request in.
Absolutely, thank you.
Sure.
All right, then I guess I'll ask one last question if there's no further questions. And, sorry, Ms. Barish.
I just wanted to save you, give you a couple more minutes. Could you...
All right, 9 o'clock at night, thank you.
Could you talk about the way you partner with other community organizations outside of the school district to support families and students?
Sure. So we have several community organizations in Pittsfield, many connected to social emotional learning and therapeutic resources. And so we can refer families to there's a family resource center connected to an organization called 18 Degrees that does a lot of therapeutic and wraparound services for students and families. So our family engagement and attendance coordinators, we meet monthly. I oversee that group, and we bring our partners into those meetings frequently to talk about services and resources that they have. It's really interesting in Pittsfield. There's a lot of organizations, but like with any organization, there's a capacity limit for who they can service. And then they're also going through the growing pains of not having enough therapeutic resources for them. So it's also just kind of problem solving through referrals, trying to keep out the Department of Children and Families as much as possible and try to go through some alternative routes. The other partnership I really want to speak to is one that we're really developing lately, which is with our Berkshire Immigrant Center. As I mentioned, I think earlier this evening, we don't have as high of a multilingual learner population as Somerville does. We don't have as many newcomers that are coming in, but we have seen that increase lately. Last year, we had a wonderful group of Afghan evacuees join our community, which was really great. But in light of that, we realized that we had a gap in the way that our enrollment process was working and how we were welcoming families. And so we've tapped into the Berkshire Immigrant Center, which is an organization that supports newcomers to our area for both legal services, educational services, classes, job resources, housing resources. And so we're partnering with them. We had them do a presentation with our principals and district leaders around typical profiles of families and students that are coming in, to have more of a sense of the backgrounds that they are coming with, and also what their experiences may have been in their home country and what their travel process was for their arrival. So they gave us examples of profiles, not with real names, but of families that they were working with that were part of the Pittsfield Public Schools, so that we could have a better sense of that. And so we've been really working with them around their services, and we actually have a meeting next week with a board member from the Berkshire Immigrant Center who's going to help us really think through our enrollment process and how they could actually be a support in terms of registration. As I mentioned in somewhere earlier today, we don't have a strong interpreter resource. So we often have to use a language links program that you call into the phone, and you can get a person for any language that you're seeking, but it feels really impersonal to do that, where you're kind of talking in, and then the family's talking in, and the person's translating to them, and then back to you. And so we're really thinking how we could work that through a little bit better, and maybe that there are families that could now serve as interpreters for us who have been in our community for a few years now, and the Berkshire Immigrant Center could actually help us train them and utilize them as resources for us. But then also just how we welcome our families. And you have the newcomer program. We have a couple of schools that have a welcome program for newcomers, and we had them present recently at a principals meeting what they're doing in their schools, so we can think about replicating that in other areas. So we'll also use that with the Berkshire Immigrant Center to get their feedback on that process, and then help us assist as we kind of transform our registration enrollment office, which is housed under my office as well. Sure.
Ms. Patone.
Thank you. Can you share a real professional challenge you had? A time where maybe you didn't live up to your own expectations or didn't live up to the community's expectations? What did you learn? And then how did you change your either educational practice or leadership approach as a result on that? So something real impactful for yourself.
Sure. So I typically use the example of when I went to Amherst Middle School, having come from Springfield, and learning how to be a principal in Springfield. I was part of a program called Project Lead. Typically, most of the people who came out of Project Lead ended up going into turnaround settings in Springfield, which had several level 4 schools at the time before they became the empowerment zone. And in that learning, it really was more of a top-down process. And that you really needed to own that building, and you needed to make quick turnaround, and it needed to happen fast and furious. And so that is how I learned to be an administrator. And when I went to Amherst, which was not an underperforming school district, and when I met with the superintendent, though, after I had kind of gone through the first round, and I can say this freely because she would agree with it, we've had lots of conversations since about it, that she thought her school was in a different place than it was, and that they were ready for a change. They were ready for more of some of the things I've talked about in terms of project-based learning, and they had been there. I had been a teacher there years before, and they were plateauing towards that work. And then I realized they hadn't gone very far in the 12 years since I had been absent. But she had said they were ready for a new building schedule, and we need to make it happen. And that's your first priority as a building principal. Just make the change, do it, work with the assistant principal. They already started to do some work last year. They had a very fast timeline for that schedule change through union negotiations, so you had to present it by December. So it was kind of fast and furious. And there was a lot of pushback around that schedule change, and they weren't ready for that. They felt they needed more time to understand it, and so did the community, because there was some shifts around world languages. We had 38-minute classes most of the days, and so it was a lot, and students were taking a world language over 2 years for a world language 1. And so we wanted to change the schedule to have more time on learning and actually have the ability for students in 7th grade, it was a 7-8 school, to be able to experience a quarter of each of the languages and then identify a language for 8th grade, where they would still enter high school with year 1 of a language under their belt. But it was a lot for people to kind of navigate through and to understand. And we just moved really fast. And what I learned from it was two things. One, take the time to know for sure that that is what folks want in a space, and don't always listen to somebody who isn't there on a daily basis. And then two is that distributive leadership, bringing in more voice to a process from, in this case, it would have been parents and students and the educators in that, and to navigate that work. So when it gets to the point to present the schedule change, it feels like it's already been vetted through many people. And particularly with educators, I think they entrust most of the time that their colleagues are making the right decisions. Similar to like a subcommittee meeting of a school committee, oftentimes you feel like you're relying on your peers of the school committee and that subcommittee to vet things before it gets to you, and that they've done the appropriate, job of that vetting before it comes to you, and maybe there has to be less of a lens on it. You can trust in that process that occurred earlier. And so we missed that step. We didn't have that step, and I just kind of ran with, get this done. I need this done this year. And that was a total mistake on my part, which I own. Sure.
Okay, last question. If you were lucky enough to be chosen to be the next superintendent of Somerville Public Schools, and you, as you mentioned earlier this afternoon, retired from here when you're at the end of your career, what would you hope people would say was your legacy here at Somerville?
It's a great question. I think for me, I left the place where equity-minded leaders and educators and students are living and learning and building a stronger Somerville.
Thank you. All right, thank you for your time. Thank you for your late night. And as there's no further business before this committee, we are adjourned. Good night, everyone.